Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zicree of Space Command, and also Mark Zicree of Phantom 2040, because I wrote episodes of that really cool animated show, and if you haven't ever seen it, check it out. It's a lot of fun and very science fictional. So now we do part 2 of my history of science fiction films in the 70s. Hooray! But first, a few corrections of part 1. So the Carradine that I could not remember the name of was, of course, David Carradine, who had done Kung Fu and later would do Kill Bill parts 1 and 2. Wonderful actor, and he was the star of Death Race 2000. Additionally, Rock Hudson was not an astronaut marooned. He was back at Mission Control. And finally, The 7% Solution, the novel and the film, came out in the 70s. The novel by Nicholas Meyer, the great Nick Meyer, who directed Wrath of Khan. He wrote that novel. It came out in 1974. So those are the corrections. And now we get on to the business at hand. First of all, let's talk about the things that were dying out and the things that were coming into fruition. You didn't tend to have that many after the bomb stories throughout the 70s. The Cold War was starting to die down. The Soviet Union was going to fall apart in time. Those fears were the strongest in the 50s and 60s. And you were moving more into ecological nightmares, population nightmares, Soylent Green kind of things, and also other dystopic views of the future. And we talked earlier about some of the lighter, more entertaining films of the period, like The Omega Man, which is about the end of the world, but in a very entertaining and peculiar way. But there were also some serious films made during that period as well, one of which was Doug Trumbull's Silent Running, which is about an ecologically devastated Earth where they send several forests into space on a spaceship with these great domed enclosures. And Bruce Dern, later to be in films like Tarantino's Hateful Eight, Bruce Dern plays a young man who's very devoted to keeping those jungles alive and those forests alive. And it has a song by Joan Baez in it. The hippie culture of the late 60s, early 70s was also very much entering into considerations of the films of that era. And Doug Trumbull, of course, had been the great visual effects genius of 2001. Later, he'd do Blade Runner, and also during this era, he would do Close Encounters. But this is a film with Silent Running, a film that he decided to direct as well. And I actually saw the miniature of that ship with the big domed forests, and it was yay big, and it was really impressive and very nicely detailed. And the visual design on the movie was very, very good. They had 3 robots nicknamed Huey, Dewey, and Louie, and they were actually played by disabled young people who would fit inside of them because they didn't have legs, or they were smaller people or whatever. It allowed them to fit inside what seemingly were robots that people couldn't fit inside. And later you would see this with R2D2 and so forth. But it's an entertaining film. It has an actor named Cliff Potts that Elaine went to school with, interestingly enough. She also went to school with Robert Englund and David Gerrold, interestingly enough. So there you go, Hollywood associations. But Bruce Dern is very good in this. It's an entertaining film. But again, really focusing on ecological, disasters and possible solutions to them. Another film that we've mentioned a bit earlier was Solaris, which was done by the great Andrei Tarkovsky. It was sort of promoted as the Russian answer to 2001, but that's not really what it was. Stanislaw Lem was the great Eastern Bloc science fiction writer. He was Polish, and the English translation of Solaris came out in the 70s. This is the first edition, and oddly enough, it was translated from the French and into English, so it was not a very good translation. And now, if you go online, you can find audiobooks and Kindle editions of a translation directly from the Polish that is much more accurate. But Tarkovsky's film of Solaris is extremely good. It's one of my favorite films, and very touching and very effective adaptation of the novel, although Stanislaw Lem himself did not like the adaptation, though, go figure. But it's a great book and a great film, and I highly recommend both. Beyond that, there was also Stalker, another Tarkovsky film that was based on the Strugatsky brothers' Roadside Picnic, which is again a very interesting film and book that clearly influenced the later film Annihilation and novel of the same name. But it's about aliens who essentially stopped on Earth, left various artifacts from their short visit here, and there's, you know, maybe they had a picnic and just kind of left their garbage, but it's created a very strange zone where odd things happen. But the aliens have gone, their ship has gone, and what's left behind is what's causing all of these peculiar events to happen. And it's a very good book. I was actually brought aboard at one point to make an American adaptation of it, a film, but and that's somewhere in my files. But it was very fun to read the book and think about how I would make that film. It would certainly have been very different from Stalker. At the same time, we talked about Clockwork Orange, another great but very controversial Stanley Kubrick film, by a book by Anthony Burgess. Originally, Anthony Burgess's novel was missing its end chapter in the American edition, possibly the English as well, I don't recall, but now it's restored. And so make sure if you're going to read the book that you read a more recent version that has the end chapter, which is also not included in Kubrick's movie either. And then there were like these odd, strange other films. We mentioned last time novelists like Ira Levin and Michael Crichton, who had a significant impact on science fiction films of the 70s with adaptations of Andromeda Strain and Crichton's film Westworld and Ira Levin's Stepford Wives and Boys from Brazil. But one other author who really had a great film made this decade was Kurt Vonnegut Jr. with Slaughterhouse Five. Now, Slaughterhouse Five is based on his experiences in World War II as a survivor of the firebombing of Dresden that killed over 100,000 people. And he had struggled for many years to figure out how to write that book, and finally he decided to make it a time travel story about a man who comes unstuck in time and keeps going between his old age and his youth and the experience in the war, and also being abducted by aliens, where he's put in a human zoo with sort of a soft-core actress named Montana Wildhack, played by the wonderful Valerie Perrine. It was directed by George Roy Hill. It's a very good adaptation, and George Roy Hill had just come off films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and it really captures the tone of the book, which is very, very sad, but also very satirical. And that balance in Vonnegut's work, which I love many of his books, very hard to capture on film. And there have been a number of films of his books since that were not successful, either financially or dramatically. But this, I think, by my lights, is the best film adaptation of one of his works. And there's a couple of very good TV adaptations of other stories. Who Am I This Time, with Susan Sarandon and Christopher Walken, and also Between Time and Timbuktu, which is a wonderful TV movie encapsulating a lot of his work with a very wonderful cast, including Kevin McCarthy, not the current guy in the Congress, but the actor from Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Long Live Walter Jameson on Twilight Zone. So you can probably find both of those on YouTube. Maybe at some point I'll present them here on Mr. Sci-Fi, but they're both excellent, as is Slaughterhouse Five if you've never seen it. And then beyond that, there was Man Who Fell to Earth, which was directed by the great Nicholas Roeg, and it stars David Bowie, who was a very good actor as well as being a rock star, and it's based on a novel by Walter Tevis, who also wrote the book The Hustler, which was made into a very good movie with Paul Newman, and he also wrote Queen's Gambit, which was just made into an extremely good miniseries on Netflix. So a very talented writer. He only did a couple of forays into science fiction, one of which was The Man Who Fell to Earth. Another was a novel called Mockingbird. Both well worth checking out. And then every now and then there'd be a film that was dealing with sort of the permutations of possible future sports. And one of them was, of course, Rollerball, which was written. It's based on a short story by William Harrison. This is the movie tie-in edition. It was made into a very entertaining film starring James Caan, who had just come off The Godfather, and it's about a sport which is extremely lethal and dangerous. And the funny part was that it was such an exciting game that during their off time, the stuntmen would actually play it when they weren't rolling cameras. So there was another remake made of it, but the original film was a lot better, and I recommend that. And then beyond that, and by the way, here's If you haven't seen it, this is the Criterion edition of Solaris, the Russian film that's much better than the American film that was made with George Clooney later, and I highly recommend this version. So check it out. You can see it a number of places, and it's really just terrific, just terrific. And so then beyond that, there was also Harlan Ellison was another very famous science fiction writer. He wrote a great novella called A Boy and His Dog, and this is one of the post-apocalypse stories in which a boy, a young man, a teenager, has a traveling companion that's a telepathic dog, and that was inspired by Harlan Ellison's real dog, who named Abu, after the character in Thief of Baghdad, who gets turned into was played by Sabu in the movie of the 40s, who gets turned into a dog, and Harlan's dog was so human-like that he named him Abu, and then that was the inspiration for A Boy and His Dog. It's a terrific but very dark novella. It was made into an extremely good adaptation, a comic book adaptation by Richard Corbin, and this is the movie version, which is not bad, not bad. And it was produced by L.Q. Jones, and who was mainly with a cowboy actor kind of guy, and Harlan liked it, and so it's worth watching. There were some very other strange kind of films during this period. Not all of them worked, but for instance, Zardoz was a very strange film directed by John Boorman, who had done Excalibur previously. Starred Sean Connery, who of course was 007, big movie star, and he's in a sort of this really weird outfit, which is sort of this little red Speedo kind of thing, and it's not the best costume for anyone, and the Zardoz has this gigantic floating weird head, and it speaks with this booming echoing voice. It's got the beautiful and wonderful Charlotte Rampling in it. It's a strange film, but interesting. So again, something you might want to check out just for like, can you believe how weird this film is? Excitement. So and so that those were some of the things that were happening during this period. Now I've mentioned previously that with the 20s, the 30s, the 50s, skipping the 40s because of World War II, each decade tended to have an iconic film, science fiction film that was a game changer. With the 20s, it was Metropolis. The 30s, it was Things to Come. The 50s, you could say Forbidden Planet, with a nod also toward, Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Day the Earth Stood Still and possibly The Thing. And the 60s, of course, it was 2001: A Space Odyssey. This decade had one film that was the huge game changer, and then one other that you could also say was a game changer in a very different way. Now there was a film that probably the most influential film of the 1970s was a film that did not actually get made. There was a very weird and interesting director named Alejandro Jodorowsky, who came from the world of the theater. And he did a couple of very strange, very out there films. One was called El Topo, another was called The Holy Mountains. And then he decided, without reading it, interestingly enough, to do an adaptation of the great Frank Herbert novel, Dune, which you can see back there on my shelf. Dune, of course, is about Paul Atreides, sort of a messianic figure who joins these desert dwellers on the planet of Arrakis, and it's got spectacular stuff. It won the Hugo for Best Novel. An amazing novel, a real game changer. And so Jodorowsky bought the book and then decides to make a movie of it. And he is in Spain, I believe, and he has a brilliant idea. He very much thinks outside the box. He's very much a rebel for the time, and he has several ideas that were brilliant. One was to pull together a team of extremely diverse artists to design the film, and among them were H.R. Giger, and there was also Mobius, the great French artist, and Chris Foss, another science fiction artist, and he brought Dan O'Bannon over to kind of do the VFX. And Dan O'Bannon had done Dark Star with John Carpenter, and Dan O'Bannon knew had previous to this he had hired an artist named Ron Cobb to do 10 concept paintings of a movie that he wanted to get made. He paid $1,000, and Ron Cobb was another brilliant artist. So Jodorowsky starts having these guys churn out concept art. And at the same time, at some point, he probably read the novel because a script was generated. And Jodorowsky was training up his own son to play Paul Atreides, and he cast Salvador Dali in a role and Orson Welles in a role. Really strange casting. Mick Jagger, I think, was going to be in it, and amazing pre-production, and it all fell apart and never got made. But there was a terrific documentary made about it. But what then happened was those artists went on to become the dominant designers of most of the major science fiction films for the next several decades. And that would include Fifth Element. That would include many films. And The Last Starfighter, and it goes on and on. If you just check these artists' credits, you'll see that it's just phenomenal. Close Encounters, Ron Cobb worked on that, etc. It was just phenomenal. So, but didn't get made. But then, when the bubble burst, they came back to America. Dan O'Bannon and Ron Cobb was here, and Chris Foss was British, and H.R. Giger was Swiss. But then there was a filmmaker who had, along with a lot of the science fiction in the early 70s, he was just out of film school, and he made his dystopic science fiction film. And he made a short film in film school that was sort of the germ of this idea, and then that allowed him to. He then made a film coming out of college that was successful, and he pulled together this short to make a feature, and the feature was called THX 1138, and it was about a dystopic future where everyone's head is shaved and they all dress in white, and they're all kind of on drugged out kind of stupors, and it's sort of like all in a world that looks like the mall. And it starred Donald Pleasance from Fantastic Voyage, and it starred Robert Duvall from To Kill a Mockingbird, and also The Twilight Zone and The Outer Limits, and many other things. And also it was and it was kind of this depressing film. It had these robot policemen with these silver faces, and it was a very interesting film, but kind of dreary and downbeat. And it wasn't a huge success, and the director decided that instead he would turn to another kind of science fiction. And the first I heard about it was when I was in college, and he put out a word that he was looking for an artist to do a Flash Gordon kind of film. And I actually submitted for that job, didn't get it. Another guy named Ralph McQuarrie did. And this film, of course, was Star Wars. And so let's see. So Star Wars, there we go. And of course, it came out in 1977, and it just turned everything on its ear. It was an enormous hit. And here's what was so great about it. If you were there, if you were a kid, it was the greatest movie ever. Now, Star Trek was that for me. Star Wars, by then I was a young adult, and so it wasn't quite that absolutely crazy, overwhelming, amazing thing that it was for people like J.J. Abrams. But for those of us who grew up reading science fiction, what it was all of these things we'd read about in science fiction novels from the 50s on. All of these amazing things that we'd read about but never seen done well in a movie were there. So it had, these gigantic beasts where they took elephants and remade them into banthas. It had robots, humanoid robots, which were, C-3PO was clearly inspired by the robot from Metropolis. It had R2-D2, which was like a little wastebasket, a little garbage can. It had, just on and on, the land speeder and the cantina sequence. The cantina scene was my favorite scene in the whole movie. The reason was because you just go into that bar and there's every alien you can imagine. There's everything happening. It's just, that sets the world, and the plot was rather simplistic, but it was told incredibly well. And this design, everything looked great. The designs were phenomenal. It was not an expensive film. It cost them like $10 million. Alec Guinness was the one classy actor in it. And my feeling is he was sort of slumming. He wasn't really bringing his A game to that role. He was just kind of doing what he'd been hired to do. But that's, neither here nor there. He's great as Obi-Wan Kenobi. But I have a feeling he was less than thinking this was his greatest role. And but meantime, it introduced Carrie Fisher, Harrison Ford, and of course Mark Hamill, all of whom gave spirited and iconic performances. And the ending is terrific with the Death Star blowing up. And it was just a movie that would inspire gazillion ripoffs and sequels, and it created a universe that is still going strong. And as with any universe in the science fiction cosmos, some of the stories are good, some of the stories are less good, but it's an incredibly durable storyline, and also can generate innumerable characters, innumerable plot lines. So that was the big game changer of the 70s. Came out in 77. But and also, it was it had Rick Baker contributing to it. It had Ron Cobb contributing Aliens and so forth to it. And Ralph McQuarrie, of course, was the perfect man and the perfect job to design incredible things. So that film was very influenced also by the technology and, of course, by the example of 2001. And another film that was an influence, highly influenced by 2001. And by the way, there was a VFX technology that emerged it was a motion control. It was where computers would allow you to match moves on separate takes, so that you could combine visual effects in ways that hadn't been possible before. And so Star Wars was, again, very cutting edge in terms of visual effects. And it was charming. It was a film that could appeal to adults. It was a film that could appeal to kids. If you were a science fiction fan, it was great. If you weren't a science fiction fan, people loved it anyway. And but the studio was caught so flat-footed in the enormous success of the film was they didn't even have the toys out yet. They didn't even, think that there was going to be anyone would want to buy any products based on Star Wars. So it took a while for them to catch up, but it was really, it holds up. It's a very fun film and really great. But another director at the time, he had done one film that was very stylish. It was a historical piece. And it did okay. It got some notice. And he was preparing to do, he's a British director, he was preparing to do a film of Tristan and Isolde, which was of this, again, another historical tale of a doomed love story. And then he saw 2001. And he thought to himself, I can't do this dusty old historical piece. I want to do a science fiction film. Now, at the same time, Dan O'Bannon, who had been working on Dune for Jodorowsky, he had commissioned Ron Cobb to paint these 10 concept paintings of a script that he had written with his friend Ron Shusett. And I saw the originals of those paintings just after they were completed along Ron Cobb's floorboards, because I met him when I was 16, and floorboards of his apartment, of his living room. And they were spectacular and wonderful and gorgeous. And you can find them online. And so the movie sold. And so the studio that bought the film, they were looking for a director. And Ridley Scott came aboard Alien. And because Dan O'Bannon was part of that visual effects team, and because he was in conversation with Ridley Scott, and Ridley Scott had a very strong artistic background, he brought aboard Chris Foss and Ron Cobb and H.R. Giger. And Giger designed the alien stuff, and Mobius and Cobb and Chris Foss designed the human stuff, the spacesuits, the spaceship interiors, all that stuff, the human stuff. And so you had two radically different design aesthetics for the human stuff versus the alien stuff. And Giger, of course, was the genius of science fiction design with Alien, just unlike anyone else before or since. And because Ridley Scott was a brilliant artist himself, he storyboarded the entire film himself. And when the studio saw his storyboards, they doubled the budget of the film. And that's the only case I know of that ever happening. And if you get the Blu-ray or the 4K version of the film, they actually have a feature where you can compare shot by shot by shot his storyboards versus the finished film. He was unlike any other director. He had a phenomenal visual imagination, and he cast the great Sigourney Weaver, who was spectacular in that film, and the creature is unforgettable, And like Star Wars, it spawned a number of sequels of varying quality, but it was another game changer, and it was really the merging of horror and science fiction in one film, done at just the highest possible quality, and so that was the other game changer in 1979, and so the 70s basically ended with Star Wars and Alien to take us into the 80s. And in addition, the directors who really had made their name in the 70s, who would create the great science fiction films of the 80s and 90s, John Carpenter, Ridley Scott, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, these are the guys who were going to really, really be at the forefront of the next few decades. And very soon we'll do the science fiction movies of the 80s and 90s, because, as I said previously, the great science fiction era in film, in my opinion, was the 70s through the 90s. And I'm so glad that I got to be part of that in television, and we'll talk about that at some point soon too. So that's it for now. If you want to throw some dollars our way on Patreon, or go to the Space Command store and buy some Space Command stuff, or buy Space Command shares at $7,500 each, please do all those things, and we will be very grateful, because we can make more wonderful stuff that we can give to you guys. So thanks for everything. We'll talk to you very soon, and that's it for now. Take care. Bye, guys.